We can't talk about food independent of health, because food and health go together like a hand in glove. And if you look at the amount that we spend in this country for food plus health, for the last 60 years hasn't really changed much. But what has changed is the ratio of what you're spending for food and health. It used to be we spent 7 and 8, 9% for health and about 18, 19% for food. Now that's just reversed. So the health is sky high because so many people are sick, for one thing. Of course, and health things cost more. But now 60% of this country has at least one chronic disease. 40% have 2 or more. You know, no country can sustain that, and it's getting worse and worse year by year. And it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare program you have. There's a lot of debate about that nowadays. It doesn't matter what kind of healthcare you have if a significant percent of the people are ill. You're going to break the country, you're going to break the system. Eventually it will come down because no society can pay for that much sickness.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Bob Quinn, an organic dryland grain farmer from Montana who's been farming without chemicals since the 1980s. Bob had so much to share about food policy, growing practices, and health of communities. We split his interview in 2, and we'll bring you the second half next week.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking today with my friend Bob Quinn. Bob, welcome. Welcome to my farm.
It's great to be here. It's a gorgeous day, and first time I've been here, so it's been a real treat.
Yeah, good. I'm very pleased to show you the thing. I've been reading your book, as I said, and it's a spectacular book. So it talks about so many important issues that we're all dealing with in this country. And one of the things that I have come to see in my journey is that food is everybody's issue.
Mm-hmm. We all eat.
We all eat, and it matters what we eat.
Yes.
And it matters how it was grown. So how did you come to that?
Well, I didn't start there, that's for sure. In fact, I was raised in a very chemical world in northern Montana. My dad was an early adopter of herbicides, and I remember him experimenting with fertilizers in the 50s and trying to demonstrate or show that was having an effect. By that time, our farm, which my grandfather started in 1920, had grown. We only can grow a crop every other year, so from 20 to 50, that's 30 years, but only 15 crops. And the soil was starting to become depleted. And the fertilizers came out, and the herbicides came out as almost like wonder drugs to these folks at this time. And they just adopted them just instantly. And no one questioned it. No one questioned any harm or long-term problem or anything, because all they saw was the short-term gain, which was right before their eyes and easy to demonstrate. So that's how I was raised, and that's what I was taught in school. I went to Montana State University, which is our ag school in Montana. I studied botany and plant pathology. That's why I was taught there. I went to UC Davis, worked on plant biochemistry, so I was a little bit removed from agriculture, but still loved it. So I would often take classes where I would just audit and do field trips, because the agriculture in California is just stupendous. Yeah. And they can have so much diversity and variety that we can't even think about in Montana. But there was the message there, and everywhere that we went. And we went to a peach orchard one time where the peaches were being picked. And I love ripe peaches, and we used to get our peaches when I was a kid in wooden boxes. They were double wrapped. If you set them on the shelf in 2 or 3 days, they were luscious and ready to eat. They're fully ripe. And these peaches on the trees looked like they were ripe. They had the color of a ripe peach. But when you bit into them, they were as green as grass. And there's no flavor, there's no taste. And and they had developed a petroleum product that you could spray on the tree, and these pieces would turn color and appear ripe, but they weren't ripe. And that was the very first time that I ever questioned anything we were doing with I call it industrial agriculture or chemical agriculture or other modern stuff. We were changing our food for the convenience of the merchandisers, the people who were selling it. They were selling it from California clear across the country. They wanted to ship it in big boxes of containers. It wasn't going to be individually wrapped anymore or shipped in little boxes. It was shipped in big crates. And if they picked it green, it wouldn't bruise. And so they looked at this as a wonderful thing. But I thought it was heresy. They were hoodwinking the eating public, which I was a part of, into buying something that looked beautiful but tasted terrible and would never ripen properly. That was the very first time, Dave, and that was in the mid-'80s or mid-'70s, early '70s, where I really first started questioning the direction we're going. And just kind of one thing led to another. When I moved back home, I was still not convinced that organic was anything to be taken seriously. I started selling my wheat off. We had a wheat and cattle ranch, and I started selling my wheat directly to whole grain bakers in California. And the second year of our business, my customer asked me for organic grain. And I said, well, of course, I'll have it to you in 10 days. Don't worry about a thing. And then I hung up the phone. I thought, man, I don't even know any organic farmers. I said, I don't even believe in this organic stuff. But I didn't let my prejudice stand in the way of keeping my customer happy and trying to help him find what he wanted.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to do. And that put me in contact with really my first organic friends in Montana who are growing organic wheat. There's only 2 or 3 or 4. And I was so impressed with what they were doing and how they talked about their farm. It was so different than what I had been seeing talked about at grain growers or farm bureau meetings when I normally went to, that I just, I'm a scientist at heart, and I just had to try it for myself. They talked about how the tilth in their soil changed so you could feel the difference walking over their fields. They talked about growing their own fertilizer, so they had no more fertilizer bills. They talked about using rotations to break up disease cycles and insect cycles so they didn't have to spray herbicides and insecticides. I thought this was amazing. Yeah. And almost unbelievable, from my background and my training. But they said it was working, and they were excited about it. And I thought, if that is really true, I want to see what it will do on my farm. And so in '86, we had our first experiment. And that was really kind of the tipping point to me. I had 2 years of experiments that both worked fabulously well compared to the chemical system we were working with. And I just went cold turkey at that point in '88. That was the last chemicals we used on our farm.
Okay, so I have so many questions already.
Okay.
Now, first of all, when your father and mother started using chemicals, was it your grandparents or your parents who? I think your parents were the first ones.
Yes,
who really,
my grandfather had retired by then.
Yeah, so was your parents.
Yeah.
And same as the farm I grew up on, my parents also same era, the 50s. Yeah. And you say it was like a wonder drug.
Yeah.
So immediately they saw their yields go up.
Well, they saw the weeds go down.
They saw the weeds go down.
So they had eliminated that. The weeds were, without rotations, you can imagine the weeds just got worse and worse almost every year, depending on how the year went for the crop.
So they weren't rotating?
No, it was winter wheat, spring wheat, and barley. And every other year it's summer fallow, which means you just cultivated the ground, you didn't grow anything on it, and save water for the next year, because we're semi-arid, that's next to a desert, right. And we get about 12 inches of rain. But it comes at the right time. But there's really not enough to grow crops every year where we are in the prairie of the northern Great Plains. And so we would, that was the rotation. Summer fallow, winter wheat, barley, sometimes spring wheat, sometimes a little oats for the cows. But it was probably 80% winter wheat. So it was very little rotation of crops.
And so the immediate wonder effect was the weeds.
Yeah, the weeds were gone. So Dad used to tell me one of his jobs was to ride on the header of the combine. So the front of the combine, which actually cuts the grain and then the reels bring the grain into the feeder house, and then it goes to the combine. He'd have to stand there with a broom handle and shove the weeds in the header, the feeder house, so they wouldn't get plugged up in the combine. That was very dangerous. Even today, that would be dangerous. That would be not allowed if anyone looked at it. It's a very dangerous thing. But it was by necessity that they were forced to deal with these weeds, and they had no way to really, without rotations and whatnot, no one was doing that. The chemicals came, and it was an instant gratification sort of to that problem. Yeah. And when they first hit them, the weeds were completely susceptible, and they just all died instantly. It was a great success. Yeah. It took many, many years and decades, Dave, before weed resistance to herbicides started to develop because of overuse. Like Roundup now is being sprayed 4 or 5 times a year. We would only spray 2,4-D is what we were spraying at that time, once every 2 years on any particular field. But now with ChemFallow and Roundup, it's being sprayed probably 4 or 5 times during the fallow year, and at least twice during the growing year, before it's seeded and after it's harvested.
So explain to people what that means, ChemFallow and dry fallow. People, you know.
Well, sure, because you guys, I can see it rains here because you know the color green.
That's right.
We don't have the color green in the summer except for early parts of June. Yeah. And after that, we have to conserve water for our next crop. And so what was done originally is people would disc, or they would plow even the fields, and so they're left completely black. And then the Dust Bowl, the 30s came, where it quit raining and the winds blew, and there was soil erosion just everywhere, and tons of soil were lost. And so then Soil Conservation Service came into being because of this. In our area, that meant strip cropping. So we would have strips that were, 50 yards wide or so of grain going across the field in one direction, north to south. And then every other strip was fallow and every other strip was grain. So you could break up the erosions, the wind, so it wouldn't erode those big chunks of soil. And so we would protect our soil in that way. And we stopped plowing. We used what we called the duck foot. It was just a shovel about 14 inches wide. It would undercut the weeds and leave most of the stubble on the ground for most of the year. The more you worked it, the more so we'd work in. But mainly there was always something on top of the soil to hold the soil from blowing away. In the early 90s, I guess, Monsanto came out with a great idea of spraying the stubble with Roundup so that it would kill everything and you wouldn't have to disturb it at all. It was called no-till. And their claim was it would also conserve moisture, because every time you work the ground, you lose some moisture. It wasn't a complete trade-off, because cracks would form and water would be sucked from way down deep up these cracks and also do some evaporating, even if you didn't till the soil. So it wasn't a complete savings on moisture, but it was easy for the farmers to do. They could spray hundreds of acres a day, hundreds, instead of maybe cultivating 70 or 80 acres a day with their big equipment. Now we have bigger equipment now, but even the sprayers are so much bigger and go so much faster that even the high cost of it was justified with the time you saved and the ease of which it was done. Yeah. So they just they kind of took that in the second wave of chemical agriculture. But because there is so much chemical being applied on the same plants, same type of plants, year after year, and even multiple times during the year, because you had to spray more than once in a fallow year, because weeds would grow back. Once you killed everything, then it rained again, then a new flush of weeds would come, so you have to spray it again. And that put so much selective pressure on the weeds that just through natural mutations, you would find weeds that eventually became resistant to that. And now we have Roundup resistant weeds. And so now they're bringing in even more harsh chemicals to control those. So that's, and many people are starting to see that. Now it's just not us organic guys that have been warning about this, for years. But now even some of my most diehard chemical neighbors are starting to see that this is a merry-go-round that has no end. Yeah. And it's just a race to the bottom. And many of them are going broke trying to pay for all this stuff and still maintain their farm and they can't, when the prices go down for crops, they can't pay their bills and they go out of business.
Yeah. Elliot calls it the drug effect. He said, you know, the first time that they gave people nitrogen and they were like, oh my God,
Yeah.
you know, it's like the crops are growing like crazy. This is fantastic. Except it was like a drug, and you just start having to use more and more, and as the organic matter in the soil got lower and lower, and you know, the whole thing started to spiral down, even though it felt so good in the very beginning.
Well, and two, Dave, the thing you have to think about is the way it was preached to us and taught to us in school. We focused on feeding the plant. So we studied the plant very carefully to see what it would need, and then imagined or thought or suppose that we could give the plant everything it needed, because we talked in terms of NPK, you know, the macronutrients. That's all we looked at, and so that's what we put on in fertilizer. And so the soil was actually a holding pot for the plant, and the life of the soil was never appreciated, was never discussed. We knew about mycorrhiza and that stuck to the roots, but no one paid any attention to that, because what was important is what you just mentioned, the nitrogen. The nitrogen is, and we know that is essential, but to think that we can short circuit the normal nitrogen cycle, which includes all the microbiology of the soil, and just add it directly to the plant, it's like mainlining.
Yeah.
It's instead of getting all of our food by eating it, just imagine we just shoot up everything. That's exactly what was going on. And that's not sustainable. It's taken many years for the long-term effect to start to be measurable or observed or appreciated, but now it's starting to be in many, many circles.
Yeah. Now you said back when you first went back to Big Sandy and you had a customer who said, well, can we get organic wheat? And at that point for you, organic was, what was it? What was your emotional reaction, honestly, as a rancher from Montana, you know, as a you know, big sky guy? what did organic symbolize to you?
Well, I had first heard the term when I was in California going to school at Davis.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine had told me about, and this is sort of the mid-70s, so this is pretty early now, but there was a small group in California that were starting, Mother Earth News was out by then. There's a small group that were starting to practice what they called organic agriculture. And a good friend of mine told me about this. But Dave, he was a law student. And I thought, what does this law student know about agriculture? I'm the farm kid, you know. I'm the guy that grew up on a wheat and cattle ranch. I know how plants grow. I know what it takes to grow wheat and the things that we were familiar with. And I really thought this organic stuff was a bunch of hooey. You know, I really thought, well, that might be nice here in California if you're going to grow, you know, whatever you're going to, spinach or something, or kale or whatever. But I didn't see how this would apply even to what we're doing in Montana, on a big scale, on a farm scale. And so I was a little surprised that here my customer, who was a fairly good-sized baker in Southern California, it's called Food for Life, they were just getting into organic. They were really focusing on whole grain. They were doing sprouted wheat breads, which are also very nutritious. This is also where I had appreciation for nutrition and what the real true purpose of food is. And they had just decided that they wanted to move toward organic. And so he just asked me that right out of the blue, Dave. It was a complete surprise to me. And I thought to myself, I didn't say anything to him other than what I told you. I said, sure, don't worry about things. Well, I thought to myself, my gosh, I said, you know, I don't, you know, as I mentioned, I didn't even believe in it. I really didn't. I didn't think that, I had heard there was one or two farmers in Montana that were doing it, not on a very big scale, but they were seeing if they could make it work, and I didn't know anything about it. So I was skeptical at best and non-believing at worst, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So what drew you to it at first was the economic opportunity that people wanted this.
Yeah. So a very important customer of ours wanted something we didn't have to give them.
Yeah.
And so rather than use the industrial model that we usually see in America and say, well, you don't want that, you know, we'll take another 5 cents off of what we got, you know, and make you happy. We said, sure, don't worry about that. We'll go find what you want. And that's kind of my way of doing business anyway. And it wasn't organic at the time or anything. It was just how I wanted to be a service to my customers. The main thing, everybody could sell them wheat, but not too many people took the time and trouble to find the right wheat for their particular needs, or if they had a problem, to help them solve their problem. I was very, very interested in helping bakers solve problems. General Mills wasn't into that business. I mean, they were the big dogs in town. We were just, you know, teeny tiny little specks on a wall compared to them. But yet we could offer some things that they didn't offer. And that's how I tried to build my business.
Yeah, yeah. So what did you discover as you looked around?
I discovered a whole new world.
Yeah.
And in a world that had great promise. That was the most exciting thing. So we're going to try, when I told you I decided I wanted to experiment on my own farm. So we decided to try 20 acres. And for our farm, that was less than 1%. My father and I were still farming together then. He was quite dubious. He told me straight out, he said, this is much too risky. We don't know anything about what we're doing. And I thought to myself, well, Dad, you've done lots of things you didn't know what you're doing. They turned out pretty good, most of them. And I had kind of the same mold. I didn't let my lack of experience hinder me from trying new things. And I said, you know, it's only 1%. Let's just see what it does. He said, okay. He said, but you know, he said, what about the market? You know, where do we sell this stuff? And then we went to our very first food show in California that same year, Natural Food Expo in Anaheim. It was in '86. And my mother and father both went down and helped me, and my cousin, who was my business partner and living in Southern California with this wheat business that we put together, built our own booth. Everything was homemade. We had no idea what we were doing. We just showed up, and thousands of people walked by in 3 days. And hundreds of them would say to us, oh, we're so glad you're doing this. Thank you very much for doing this and having organic at this point. Because at this point now, we'd had organic several years, and almost half our business was organic by this point, yeah, in '88. And we were introducing stone ground whole wheat flour, all high protein from Montana. And my father, after that, he came home and he said, wow, he says, there is a market of this. This lowers the risk. Yeah. So now he's less resistant. He's not sold, but he's less resistant. Yeah. And the first experiment was growing 20 acres on alfalfa plow down. So this great field had been in alfalfa for 4 or 5 years. We worked that in that summer and planted winter wheat in the fall. And next to it, we had 20 acres of our normal chemical regime. And so I did soil tests on the alfalfa plow down to see where the nitrogen was, because that's our main thing we look at. It was quite high. And I added nitrogen to my other field to bring them both up to the same level. So we say the nitrogens are comparable, at least how we could measure them. And when we harvested the crop, well, first of all, the other thing I did, I closed the spacing between the rows in half, from 14 inches that we normally use for winter wheat, which made a big high ridge between each row to catch snow and help the wheat from winter killing. So it had a little insulation. I used my spring wheat drills, which was only 7-inch spacing, and planted winter wheat with it. And all the neighbors said, well, you're going to fail right there. The winter wheat's all going to die, and because it doesn't have enough protection. But my organic friends told me, said, your best weed control is a good canopy of your crop, of your cash crop. And the competition of that will take out your weeds. And so the narrow spacing was very important for that to work. And so that's why I did that. And in the spring, of course, the first thing I did, got out there just as early as I could, like a day like this, and the snow's still on the ground, but you can see that if the grain is still alive and green underneath, just at the soil surface, and it was. So I passed the first test. It came up beautifully, And at harvest time, the yields were almost identical that year. It wasn't a great, it was an average yield. The organic field was about 35 bushel an acre. The chemical one was like 36 or 37. It wasn't significantly different. It was in the same, almost the same. The protein was also just about the same. The chemical field was like 15.3 and the organic field was like 15.5 or so, just a little above, but it wasn't statistically different. The takeaway message, Dave, was that both fields produce similar quantity and similarly quality, but one used no purchased additives of chemical fertilizer. It was a result of growing it in the alfalfa for several years in this case. My dad was astonished. Here he had been spending every year tens of thousands of dollars for these chemicals to increase his yields and increase his protein, and this young, whippersnapper of a kid of his had come back from California going to school and matched that with no inputs. And I said, wow, look at this, Dad. I said, let's plant half the farm organic next year. He said, oh no, whoa, wait a minute. He said, how about 15%? I said, how about 25? How about 20? I said, okay, 20. So anyway, we converted 20% of the farm. Then the next year, we started into an organic rotation, which the transition is a little bit tough because you have to build up the soil. First, we didn't do that in the beginning. We just quit using chemicals. And then we started building up the soil with legumes and alfalfa, sweet clover as we went. But the second year, so this is 1988 now. The first crop was planted in 86, harvested in 87. Now it's 88 after we saw the results from 87. And we had a drought year. And in a drought year in Montana, it's not a question of how much money you're going to make that year, it's how much you're going to lose. Yeah. And so if you can reduce your input costs, then your losses are going to be reduced. Now that could be a big factor. And it was a severe drought. And a severe drought in Montana also normally is accompanied by grasshoppers. And we had a terrible grasshopper plague that year. And of course, with the chemical agriculture, well, I know what to do. I just call up my spray pilot buddy in town and say, hey, Tom, we got grasshoppers. Okay, so I'll be there in the morning. Here comes a plane, and he sprays with malathion. And in a few minutes, everything's dead. And then he would say to me, now, Bob, he says, now remember, he says, don't go in that field for 24 hours. After all, malathion, it's a poison, Yeah, I know. So anyway, we knew it was a poison, and it killed everything, the good things along with the bad things. We didn't have much appreciation for the good stuff it killed. But I didn't have any idea what to do with my organic fields. And I called up my organic friends, and I said, Bill, what are we going to do? Like, the grasshoppers are coming, they're going to eat everything. And they said, oh, now just calm down. They said, you can get this protozoa. It's a little smaller than the bacteria. It's called Nosema locusta. You put it on some wheat bran, you spread it around the edges of your field, and the grasshoppers come in, they eat that, and they get sick. And then all their friends come after theirs, and they eat them. They eat their sick buddies. It's kind of like American politics today, you see. And that's what happened. And by harvest time, there was almost no grasshoppers left, even though they ate probably 20 or 30 feet, almost bare, into the edge of the field. The middle of the field was completely without grasshoppers. And even though it wasn't a great crop, because it was a drought year after all, we still had some harvest there. Meanwhile, across the creek bottom in the chemical field, in about 10 days, the malathion was gone, and the next wave of grasshoppers came in. They started coming in. And I couldn't afford to spray it twice, and we didn't. And at harvest time, there's very little grain there. We had more grasshoppers probably in the grain tank than we had grain. And so 2 years in a row now, we've had great success with organic system compared to our chemical system. It's supposed to be the scientific epitome of what was wonderful in American agriculture. And I said, Dad, look at this. It's black and white. I said, I'm not going to use any more chemicals at all on our farm again. And he didn't say a word. He just nodded, and he was agreeable. And that's how we started. So it was kind of a crash course. I wouldn't recommend that. But I was so enthused to try to learn how to make our farm a successful organic system. And you can't learn, Dave, you can't learn to walk if you're always going to have a crutch. And so I just went cold turkey on the whole thing. We were in a position I was convinced it wouldn't sink us. And within a couple of years, I mean, it was a little bit rough. We didn't know what we were doing, as I mentioned earlier. But within 2 or 3 years, maybe 4, we had paid off our operating note. And that's unheard of in our areas. That means that the money you borrow in the spring to run your farm until you harvest, we didn't have it anymore. We were able to reduce our operating costs by growing our own inputs, increase the value of what we sold, and the difference of those two, we took to the bank, and we didn't need an operating note, and that spoke to us for itself. So I was an instant convert, you could say.
Yes. So there's some important things there to just touch on. One is the big question, which is, why didn't all your neighbors become organic?
Well, do you have coffee shops here in Vermont? Yeah, right? You know what happens there? That's where all the farmers go and they brag about their yields. It's kind of like when they go fishing, you know, how big a fish is.
Yeah.
And one thing that we don't have big bragging rights on in organic is our yields. But that is so ingrained in farmers' mentality. It's linked with success.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. They never talk, and the chemical companies are pushing this. They never talk at their big meetings or anything on net return. They only talk about yields.
Yeah.
And how many bushels per acre you're going to get.
Yeah.
Well, and the other problem and in the beginning, of course, we didn't know what we're doing. It takes a little while to get things in balance. We had a lot of weeds showing up that we didn't have before when we were spraying everything.
Yeah.
So we had what people were calling me the weed farmer, you know, behind my back.
Yeah.
And they were taking bets in town to see which was going to happen first. Am I going to go out of business first, or give it up and go back to reality and go back to what would make sense, you know, like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And so they didn't see the whole picture the way I saw it.
Right.
And then, of course, when we started to have some success and get our weeds under control with the rotations and whatnot, then they were convinced I was spraying at night. I mean, it was just unbelievable to them that you could succeed without all these things that everybody said was necessary now.
Yes.
After just a few decades.
Yeah.
It felt like it was necessary, even though for thousands of years. That's why, you know, people talk about conventional agriculture, and it's kind of the hot button for me because to me, conventional agriculture is what we've been doing for 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And what we've been doing the last 50 or 60 years is a gigantic industrial chemical experiment. And the wheels are starting to come off that bus in so many different ways. And the farmers are mostly paying the price for that. So I don't like to call that stuff conventional. I call that, you know, chemical or the great experiment or whatever.
Yeah.
And if we mimic, and what I've learned as an organic farmer and then promoter is the closer we can mimic nature, the more success we can have. And you look out at nature, you don't see any monoculture. You see great diversity. You see that the soil, you don't see the soil, but it is really what's making everything work. But the plants that grow through it and on it and the organisms that live in it all take and give different aspects that make the whole thing sustainable and renewable.
Yeah.
And that's how it works.
Yeah.
And the closer we can mimic that, I think, as farmers, the more successful we're going to be in the long term.
One of the things that I have encountered a lot in the last 7 years or so as I've gotten into more public conversations about this. These used to be very private conversations for me.
Yes, right.
And I just did what I did, and people bought our tomatoes because they were delicious. It worked. But one of the things I found is that there is this thing, I think what Stuart Hill would call shallow organic, which means no conventional pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's deep organic, which means, and this is everything that organic ever meant as a movement,
Mm-hmm.
which is that the food isn't just not bad for you, it's actually good for you.
Yeah, right.
You know, that it doesn't just not have poison on it, it actually has a much deeper level of nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that those same effects are mirrored at every level in terms of impact on the community, impact on the water, impact on the air. That these are actually positive impacts, impact on the climate.
Yep.
So, do you believe that the wheat that you grow on your farm now that the organic wheat grown under that system is nutritionally superior?
Well, I do. But let me qualify that a little bit. I didn't really, as I mentioned just earlier a little bit, I didn't really get into the nutritional aspect of this immediately. With wheat, there was no research about that, for one thing. We ran into a period in the 90s where wheat started to become, the bad boy in the block. And everybody was going wheat-free and gluten-free because of nearly 20% of the people in this country could no longer eat what we call modern wheat without difficulty. And we had an ancient grain that I had first seen when I was a kid at county fair. And my father was quite enamored with this because a friend of his had actually brought this back from Portugal and sent it to a friend of his in our county. And it grown, and it's supposed to come out of a tomb in Egypt. Well, it grew, and so that should have been the first clue it wasn't 4,000 years old coming out of tombs, right? Because seeds don't really last that long. It doesn't matter if they're in a tomb or not.
They last a long time, but not 4,000 years.
No, not 4,000 years, not 4,000. And so anyway, it was a novelty. It was a giant wheat. I always take some of my hat now. It was a giant wheat that the kernels were about 2 or 3 times bigger than the normal wheat. We took it to this food show, and out of all these hundreds of people that came by, my dad had a little jar. He was showing it to everybody, and one person said, "This is just what I'm looking for." And because of that one person, we went home. We had 50 pounds or so in storage by then, because we had another guy was interested many years before, but then they lost interest before we had enough to give it to them or give for their product. So because that one person, we planted all 50 pounds in a half acre. And then, to make a really long story really short, within about 30 years, we were up to 100,000 acres of this stuff. It's scattered around 250 organic farms in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Most of it being sold into Italy, 75%, where they make over 3,000 different products. It's just amazing how it's taken off. But in the very beginning, we thought of it as a novelty, something that would be unusual. And if somebody wanted something, where it could be another crop in our rotation. Well, I had a friend in California. He said, "Well, I've got an idea for this," and he took it to a pasta manufacturer, and they made pasta, and it made a wonderful whole wheat pasta that was had a very nice smooth texture. Whole wheat pasta in those days was just ground up modern durum, and it was very gritty and scratched the back of your throat. This didn't do that. It was very soft. Had a soft brand, we found out later. And it was a soft, nice texture. Well, my dad gave a package of this to a lady who lived in a nearby town who had such terrible food allergies that she couldn't eat wheat or many other things, and they were completely debilitated her. And I said to my dad, so this is about 89 now or so, and I said, "Well, Dad, why did you give her that pasta? You know she can't eat wheat. It's going to make her sick." He said, "Well, he says it's organic, isn't it?" So here my dad is now. He's more converted than I am, you see. So anyway, this lady called back the next day, and she said, "What is this stuff?" She said, "When I ate it," and she did a little kinesiology muscle testing to make sure it wouldn't make her terrible ill, and she thought she could try it, so she ate it. She said, "But when I ate it, it made me feel better." I said, "Wow, never heard of that before." "Well, we'll give you some more." And then she said, and a few days later, she said, "You know, I have a sister, and she has all kinds of food allergies, and she can't eat wheat either. Could we send her some?" And I said, "Sure, we'll send her a whole box." We sent her a whole carton full of these little sample bags. She called us back in 2 or 3 weeks, and she said, after she had eaten this, maybe nearly a month, she said not only could she eat it, and it made her feel better, but she became less sensitive to other foods that she was having trouble with. And when I heard that, I said, "Oh, wow, this isn't just a novelty. This is like, a gift from the Lord or something to help people feel better, to heal."
This is medicine.
And this is medicine. And then my scientific, juices started running again. I said, we need to understand what's going on with this. I couldn't find anybody in America, hardly in the early 90s, that believed, first of all, that took seriously the food or the wheat allergy or sensitivity idea. Most of them said, well, if it's in their head, that they just believe it's not good for them, and so it's a fad. But in Italy, I found a group in University of Bologna and University of Florence that really did want to look at it. Because in Italy, if you can't eat your pasta, I mean, you just don't run down the street and buy wheat-free, gluten-free. First of all, it doesn't exist. But you want to eat your pasta and you want to know why you can't. And so they were very interested in this. Yeah. And they started doing research, and it cost us a lot of money. But we ended up with 35 peer-reviewed journal articles that were published in high-class, highly reputable journals, mostly in Europe and US journals, that clearly identified the differences between modern wheat and ancient wheat and how it affected the body. And in the last dozen or so papers have dealt with chronic disease. And so we did human clinical trials. We don't know how this worked. We don't know the mode of action, but we know when people eat modern wheat or eat ancient wheat in a double-blind crossover study. So one group would eat one, then another group, and the other group ate the other. Then they cross over after having a washout period for 6 or 8 weeks, so that nobody knew what they were eating. And so they were both told it was going to be good for them because they didn't want them to think negatively. But we started studying heart disease, diabetes, irritable bowel syndrome, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia. Those are the main ones that we published on. These are all major diseases that affect mankind throughout the whole world. And we found there was a tremendous difference in how wheat had an effect on these diseases. What we found that modern wheat in every case was inflammatory at some level, and this ancient wheat was anti-inflammatory. And the difference was like 35 to 45%. It was huge. Medicine, pills couldn't mimic that. And the researchers were just astounded. They'd never seen anything like this before. And it really started to bring into my whole understanding of teaching of Hippocrates 2,300 years ago that food should be your medicine and medicine should be your food. And it was right in front of me, the very epitome of that. And to think that wheat is a food which was a staple for ancient civilizations of particularly the Western world, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Phoenicians, all these great civilizations that existed in even parts of China, in India. And yet today it's forbidden for 20% of the people to eat it. So what's happened? And a lot of people say, well, don't eat wheat at all. That's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We need to understand what we've done with modern wheat, with the breeding program, which is so focused on yields, that we have so diminished nutrition and brought other problems into effect that now 20% of the people have trouble eating it. So it does make a difference of what seed we put in the ground. So the soil is very, very important. It's the heart. But what we put through that heart, the blood that goes pumped through that heart, really makes a difference if it's good blood or bad blood. And the bad blood, in many cases, is a result of the loss of nutrition by focusing on too much on just one external or industrial component, and that's either manufacturing components to make it easier or more profitable to manufacture, or higher yields. And that's what we've done with wheat.
This reminds me of, I have a friend in Germany she works for Naturland, and great group. And she said, we're not just about organic products. We want to create an organic landscape where all the parts are working together. And you see that if you think you can just take the same seeds and put them in organic soil and grow, it is better.
Yes, it is better.
But if you can find a seed that actually works better in that system, and there's been this long evolution through history to get there, then we can have food that is genuinely more healthful, although the yields will not be as high, and that's where the economics has to shift if this is going to succeed. So I'm interested, when you chose to take your farm fairly rapidly to organic, part of why you were able to do that is you were convinced that there was a market that would pay you a price high enough to justify the reduction in yield.
Yes. And at that time it was. The price for chemically raised grain was quite low. And in the very beginning, we were getting $1 premium over a $3 bushel. So that meant that we were increasing the value by a third. That's huge.
Yeah.
But when we started with our Kamut project, the ancient grain project, we just arbitrarily set that price at 3 times the chemical price of grain, because the yield of that was even lower.
Yeah.
Because now we had a grain that had never been bred for high yields. So you had the organic aspect. Actually, it fit the organic system quite well, because it wasn't being pushed for high yields. It was being pushed for the things it adapted to, like you said, and the organic system was very akin to the thousands of years of adaptation, I think. So that went quite well. And people, you touch on this, the thing that I think a little bit, Dave, the thing that we need to talk about, when we talk about price, we can't talk about food independent of health, because food and health go together like a hand in glove. And if you look at the amount that we spend in this country for food plus health, for the last 60 years hasn't really changed much. But what has changed is the ratio of what you're spending for food and health. It used to be we spent 7 and 8, 9% for health, and about 18, 19% for food. Now that's just reversed. So the health is sky high because so many people are sick, for one thing. Of course, and health things cost more. But now 60% of this country has at least one chronic disease. 40% have 2 or more. You know, no country can sustain that, and it's getting worse and worse year by year. And it doesn't matter what kind of healthcare program you have. There's a lot of debate about that nowadays. It doesn't matter what kind of healthcare you have if a significant percent of the people are ill. You're going to break the country, you're going to break the system. Eventually it will come down, because no society can pay for that much sickness. So you can't, so people are always saying to me, oh, organic is so expensive. Organic is not expensive at all when you combine it with health. And if you eat more organic and have better health, the healthcare costs come down, so you can afford to pay the farmers a decent price for their organic food that they grow, and everybody wins. Yeah. And that's another one of my business philosophies, is that everybody should win. In order for a business to be sustainable, everybody has to win. Yeah. You can't make your profit on the backs of somebody else doing your free work for you. And you cannot talk about organic food in the absence of health. They have to go together to make sense for what's going on. I always tell people that there's a very high cost of cheap food in this country. And it's, you don't pay it at the checkout counter. First of all, the farmers start to pay it by getting the low cost of production for what they grow. And many of them in our area, half of my neighbors are gone bankrupt or just sold out because they couldn't make it anymore. Half of them in my generation. Then there's the high cost of the communities. When those farmers go, the communities suffer. My little town of Big Sandy was 1,000 people when I was in high school 50 years ago. Now it's 600. And the main street is decimated. There's a high cost to our environment. You know, glyphosate now is in our rain that falls on our farm and falls on everybody's farm. It's so prevalent. It's in the rain that is everywhere. We are contaminating the earth upon which we live. We have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's the size of New Jersey. Children are forbidden to drink well water from Iowa because of the nitrates in it that are so high. How bad does it have to get before we think that maybe we're going in the wrong direction with this? So anyway, but the last one, I think, is even the most hideous one. It's the one I've already mentioned, and that's the high cost to our health and the number of people now that are sick. Those are the high costs of this cheap food system that we have, this industrial chemical system that's producing very cheap food and plentiful because of high yields that we talked about. But yet it's devastating to our people and to and whoever eats it, not only our people, but wherever it would go.
Yeah. So that's a more sophisticated conversation that needs to happen.
Yes.
If we take a very simplistic view and say, well, we're making food that people can afford, you could just as well say you're making food that makes people sick.
Yeah.
And you know, let's talk about the whole system.
The whole picture. The whole
You
picture.
got to look at the whole picture.
Yeah.
And a lot of there are strong economic incentives not to.
Yeah, of course. Because the people who are making money now with the system that's in place, they're making billions and billions, Dave. And look at the influence they have in Washington. It doesn't even matter what party's in power. They're there. And they're influencing whoever is in a position of decision making, to the point of it actually goes their way in most cases.
Yeah.
And that's just as in control. They do not want to lose that control. They're happy with everything the way it is now. We got the drug companies, big pharma on one side, making billions of dollars, pushing billions of pills because people are sick. We have the chemical food industrial complex on the other side, pushing billions of dollars worth of chemicals, so farmers can get more yields, which are contaminated and also not as nutritious and getting people sick. So they're playing into big farmers' hands. Now we have companies like Monsanto that have been sold to Bayer, so we have some companies that own both ends of this money-making deal. And they're not even American anymore, for heaven's sakes. So we're shipping out all of our resources as well as losing our good health.
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense at all unless you have the ability to, by such marketing and such influence, that it's made into a facade that looks gorgeous to everybody. And the facade is cheap, plentiful food for everybody. No one has to worry about going hungry. And that was, after World War II, when we saw what happened in Europe and the devastation of famines, I think that the government decided, and it was a very noble idea, that we should never go hungry in this country. We should never have that. And so the cheap, plentiful food was the main focus. No one, I think in the beginning, no one anticipated the fallout from that mentality, or the takeover by such a select and small group of powerful international cartels.
Yeah. You know, Eisenhower's famous speech about the military-industrial complex. And, of course, we've got the industrial agriculture complex now. And I think I heard, it was at our rally, Shelley Pingree spoke. And she said, more money is spent in Washington, D.C. lobbying food than is spent lobbying defense.
Wow.
And she said, think about that.
Yeah.
And all they're doing is try to control the opinions of the politicians in Congress.
Yeah.
And they're quite successful.
Of course they are, and they paint the picture that they want painted.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you will subscribe, tell your friends, and leave us a rating and review. A video version of this interview can be found at realorganicproject.org/episode 74. Please join us next time when we bring you the second part of today's interview with organic grain farmer Bob Quinn. To support this podcast and our certified farms, become a recurring donor at realorganicproject.org and get the benefits of being a real friend, including our book club, where you can ask our favorite authors your questions. See you next time.